morning, everybody. Thanks ever so much for joining us for our Accessible Homes Week webinar. Welcome to this hour of chat about accessible housing. As many of you will know, Habinteg runs Accessible Homes Week every September, and our idea for this week is to really celebrate what accessible housing can do in the lives of disabled and older people, and to put a spotlight on what policy there is in this arena and what needs to change to make more accessible homes come forward to really meet the needs of the community. So our panel today comes from a really wide range of interesting perspectives. They'll introduce themselves a bit more in detail later, but we've got with us Mark Fosbrook from the West Midlands Combined Authority. We have property developer Ruth Hunter and her architect Suzanne Tate, who are going to talk a little bit about their work. We're really pleased to be joined by a member of Habiteg's Insight Group, Chris Hickin. We have Farah Munir from the Centre for Accessible Environments. And my partner in crime on the research that we're going to talk about is Rosie Tenadine from Habiteg's policy team. So that's what we've got lined up for you today. So the focus for this week in Habinteg is all around the forecast for accessible housing. As many of you will know, it's now 10 years, and it was mentioned just now in our little timeline as we came along. It's now 10 years since Part M of the building regulations was expanded to provide two accessibility standards: the M42 standard, which is the accessible and adaptable standard, which is a bit similar to lifetime homes, and the M43 standard, which is homes that are designed to meet the needs of wheelchair users. And within the policy framework that we have, those are deemed at the moment to be optional standards, which means that local authorities have the job of setting policies out for how they should be built, how many of those types of homes should be built within their ambitions for new homes in their area. So it's really important for us at Habinteg to keep an eye on how a local authority is doing that job and what does it mean for the future of accessible housing in the country. So we've developed a method for forecasting based on what we find in English local plans. I suppose context for that at the moment that's important is, well, how many homes do we have in the general population that are in any way accessible? And at the moment, the latest figure from the English Housing Survey suggests that that's around 12.5% that meet what they call the visitability standard. But I think that anybody who knows much about M41, that's the baseline standard for new homes, would probably agree that it's not the most accessible standard, in particular, providing issues in terms of circulation space, use of entrance level WC that can be quite awkward for a disabled person, and really prevent it from being a truly visitable home. So for us to achieve a fully inclusive society, we feel it's really essential that disabled people have the same opportunities for finding the right homes for them as non-disabled people. And to make that happen, we really need new homes to all meet a minimum standard of accessibility. So I'm going to hand over to Rosie in a minute, who's going to talk about what we found through this survey. But yeah, just to recap, what we've done is we've monitored how those optional standards are taking shape in local plans. We've looked at how many homes people have got ambition to build and worked out therefore over a 10-year period. All the figures that you're going to see relate to the next 10 years. And then we've just compared that to how the picture was back in 2020 when we last published a report on this. You can please do check out the full report. I'm pretty sure that Sharon will put a link into the chat for the full report. So there's a lot more detail to be had than what we're going to share with you now, but we're just going to focus in on the top few findings for this morning's session, because want to hear from all our excellent panelists. So I'm going to hand over to Rosie now, who is going to just talk you through some of the key findings from the new forecast.
Thanks, Christina. I've got a lovely physical copy here in front of me. Yeah, so what did we find? So I have the good news of starting with some reasons for optimism. So in this report, we were pleased to find that since our last forecast in 2020, there's been a much greater uptake of homes built to the Part M optional accessibility standards. So if we click to the next part, you can see that whereas in 2020, there were 170 plans that were not referring to M42 or M43, or using outdated accessibility standards, that's reduced to the 2025 part, which is now only 103. So there's been a much greater uptake of that M42 and M43 accessibility standard. And on the next slide, you can see that we have another cause for celebration, which is the positive direction of travel for accessible homes, demonstrated by analysis showing that local plans in their draft stage hold more ambition. We think this might be down to the impact of the government's commitment to raising accessibility standards, which is the reason for this welcome direction of travel. So plans in their draft stage compared to the adopted stage are more likely to show more commitment to accessible homes. And on to the next slide, please. However, that's sort of where the positives draw to a close. This graph aptly highlights the consequence of the growing disparity for wheelchair user homes. As you can see on the purple line, there's a sharp increase in ambition for M42 homes, which has risen by 163%. But this isn't reflected in the delivery of wheelchair user homes, which is shown in the green line. In numbers, we can expect to see up to, in a best case scenario, 1 million more accessible and adaptable homes. However, for wheelchair user homes, this is only 50,000, which leaves a vast majority of the population without homes that meet their needs, essentially. You might consider this to be the impact of local authorities' careful planning. But actually, when you look at the vastness of regional disparities in requirements, that doesn't seem to be the case. So if we go to the next slide, you can see that whereas in London, the provision for wheelchair user homes per head of population is 1 per 210, in the Northwest, that figure is 1 in 2006. So you're 10 times more likely to have access to a wheelchair user home in London than you are in Manchester, Warrington, or Liverpool, which leads us to our second finding, which is that we're still living within an accessible home postcode lottery. In the most extreme cases, this can mean that some families are forced to move to completely different parts of the country just to find a home that meets their needs so they can lead independent and dignified lives. And then to our third major finding, a fifth of local authorities have chosen to introduce what's known as a tenure split. In practice, this means that 61 local authorities set differing requirements between market homes and affordable homes, which creates two major problems. The first is that the majority of housing delivery in this country comes from the market sector. So by setting weaker requirements, we're missing a huge opportunity to build more wheelchair user homes. For instance, Greater Manchester Combined Authority, while it champions itself as an age-friendly house builder, it doesn't make any provision for wheelchair user homes. So you can just imagine the opportunities that are going missing in one combined authority alone. And to the next slide, this basically shows how fewer wheelchair user homes are set to be built to the M43 standard in market delivery. And we know that developers have a tendency to negotiate accessible requirements downward on a viability basis. And until we introduce a trackable method to see how many M43 homes are actually being delivered, we'll never truly know how many homes are being delivered in the market and affordable sector. And that is already being pushed lower and lower by developers, unfortunately. And our last finding today was that by analysing 311 local plans, myself and Christina, we realised quickly how complex, vague policy wording has the potential to withhold delivery. Language such as that picked up here, so like wherever possible, where practical, it introduces doubt, which gives developers an opportunity to downscale its commitment to the higher accessibility standard. So our recommendation is instead of using language which points out obstacles to achievement, we encourage local plans to use plain and robust wording with clear percentages, which show ambition and can avoid ambiguity. So those were the major findings that we unpacked from this forecast for accessible homes 2025. So yeah, you've got the full report. If you're worried or if you want to look more into the numbers, they're all there. But those were our major findings. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosie. And the other thing that you will find in our report is a raft of recommendations that Habinteg are making off the back of these insights. Broadly, focusing on what the government can do through its long-term plan for housing and creating the conditions for more accessible homes to be built without having to rely on local authorities to put those policies in their local plans. Obviously, the most important first step of that is bringing in a new regulatory baseline and creating M42 as the standard for all new homes, but also what they can do to really encourage people to be more assertive about their planning for wheelchair accessible properties. Do have a look at the report and the full set of recommendations. Okay, so that's a little bit about sort of the policy landscape, what's going on right at the sort of the first part of the cascade, if you like. We're now going to go all the way to the other end, and we're going to go to the perspective of the people who are building homes, so developer perspective. And I'm really happy to introduce Ruth Hunter from Veredus Developments. And Ruth, I met about this time last year in the queue for a parliamentary event, and I was really impressed by Ruth's enthusiasm and zeal for the topic of accessible homes. So I'm really happy that she could join us today, along with Suzanne Tate, who is Ruth's partner in crime on a current project. So Suzanne's an architect. So well, first of all, I would just like to speak to Ruth to find out, Ruth, a little bit about sort of what type of developments you do and why are you focusing on accessibility?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel because there are just so many amazing people. So it's a real honour to be included in this panel and to have these discussions. So I'm actually, just for clarity, I'm still relatively new to developing. I've actually been developing for 4 to 5 years. And when we say developer, I think it's really important to clarify there are different types of developers in the property world. And I'm somebody who takes existing properties and renovates them and turns them into something new, as opposed to doing new builds. And one of the things that I focus on is HMOs, so homes with multiple occupants. And we provide properties for young professionals, but I also do supported living where we house homeless and adults with learning difficulties. And basically, the reason for being really passionate about this subject, I don't have any lived experience, I don't have any disabled family members. So people do ask, well, why am I advocating for this? And it all came from a podcast I heard with Guy Harris, who runs Accessible PRS. And it was with Lisa Brown for the Supported Living Network. And it was the statistics that he said in that podcast, which really, they didn't just shake me, they disgusted me, actually. And it made me realise that we have a large part of our society who, as developers and investors and landlords, we have absolutely no idea with regards to the situation, with regards to the lack of accessible housing. I'm part of a major network, huge network around the country of property investors, and I have never, ever heard anybody talk about accessible housing. In all the years I've actually been following, I've been into property for about 10 years, and I've never heard it discussed. And so with that, I kind of felt, well, I'm a problem solver. I love solving issues, and my passion for supported housing. I'm very much about property isn't just about return on investment for me. It's very much a different ROI. It's return on impact. And so with that, I set on the journey to find out more with regards to how I could try to produce more accessible housing. And it's been an amazing journey so far.
So, in terms of your HMO model, so that what we used to call house shares, right,
Yeah, yeah.
back in the early
The
days.
old days.
So, are there any particular challenges that come with trying to apply an accessible housing principle in that kind of development?
Yeah, so the last property that we developed, we turned that into a universal property with ground floor bedrooms, and it already had a wet room on the ground floor. So instantly I viewed it and went, well, brilliant, we're keeping that. Where the majority of developers today, and again, I'm emphasising not new build, I'm talking about the developers who are producing properties to rent and to flip, and they are retrofitting, will rip those bathrooms out and we'll put bathrooms upstairs. And so for me, when I saw this property, it worked brilliantly. However, none of the doors were widened. They were all still 73 centimetres, despite it had a wet room. Even the wet room door was 73 centimetres. You couldn't get a wheelchair in. It was ridiculous. So the conversion of that property was actually relatively straightforward. I think the challenge was actually getting the builders to understand why we wanted to widen the doorways and all of the openings. And the charge, I think now it's naivety, but understanding that I was probably taken for a bit of a ride as well, because they charged me £1,200 per doorway just to make it wider, which at the time I did question, but they said, no, that's just what we charge. So I do think working with the right builder is absolutely key. I think that's a real challenge for developers like me, is actually finding the power team and the right people to work with. I think, and I've got very strong views about how we as investors, and certainly HMO investors, we should be providing properties that allow wheelchair users to live in HMOs. And I think the challenge that we currently have is the discrimination that we have around disabled people. A lot of landlords I speak to, well, I say a lot, I've had people actually question me, saying it's all well and good producing ground floor bedrooms, wet rooms on the ground floor, universal kitchens, so that young adults who are self-caring can live with their peers. But will people want to live with disabled people? That's actually been said to me. Their concern is that they then won't rent the rest of the rooms because people don't want to live with disabled people. And I think there's a very big discussion to be had around that as well. And I would say with regards to producing HMOs that have accessible rooms, I would say that is actually probably one of the biggest challenges.
Wow, that's really a harsh reality to confront, but I can imagine those words coming out of out of
Yeah,
somebody's
I
mouth. But
I
yeah,
was
that's
I was shocked, and the issue is I don't have the evidence to show them that actually by providing accessible rooms in an HMO for young adults to be able to live with their friends and their peers would actually reduce suicide rates, reduce depression, increase employment rates. You'd have longevity of tenancies. You'd have groups of friends with a disabled person who would take over the whole house. I can say all this, but I don't have the evidence yet to do that. And it's
mm,
just a case of we've just got to produce the product. So
yeah.
then we've got the anecdotal evidence.
That's really interesting, and that just sort of kind of reminds me of like one of Habinteg's founding principle was that disabled people should be living in communities in the same types of environments as non-disabled
Yeah,
people, and in the modern world, HMOs is one of those environments, isn't it? So,
absolutely. And it's a
yeah,
crucial key to the solution for affordable housing for young people. Young people are stuck at home or they're stuck in unsuitable properties. And if we could just think slightly differently about, what I'm talking about is this isn't just about producing new builds. There is a much larger scope here, and the type of developer that I speak to, hundreds of developers around the country, they are retrofitting properties. So my aim is actually to educate them and for them to be able to produce properties as well as the new builds, because that's where there could also be a major change.
mm, fantastic. Well, thank you. Love to talk to Suzanne now a little bit about the kind of practicalities side of things. So, Suzanne. You're working with Ruth currently on a project. Can you tell us a little bit about your kind of philosophy around inclusive design? We had a chat the other day, and I think you're a rare find as a designer and architect.
Yes, unfortunately, unfortunately, you are not wrong. And Ruth and I, we've had these conversations often in terms of studying interiors architecture, how much we discriminate by design, and that within our courses, when the new graduates are coming out of school, they know very little about universal or accessible design. So, in our practice, our main focus is not only on accessibility, but on that equity of experience, whether that it's through urban design or interiors, whether it's for elderly or young people or just families with pushchairs. It is super important to really look at what the experience of the space is. not just from being able to get to it, but also how we look at it. Because if I'm putting accessible lift somewhere at the back of the broom cupboard, the person who needs to use a pushchair or use that lift is not going to have the same experience of somebody who walks into the foyer and is able to use the rounded staircase that goes all the way up. So I think this is super important, but I think what Ruth already touched on, it's the mindset. A lot of the myths are still around in terms of what this accessibility design means, and that's along the entire supply chain in real estate. That's coming from the estate agents and how they devalue properties that are accessible, how we consider aesthetics of the buildings, how we look at resales values, how we look at the actual refurbishment costs. A lot of the times, developers think that it's going to cost them more to provide accessible homes, which not necessarily is the case. So I think working with Ruth on this particular project, we are looking to debunk a lot of these myths.
Mm. So in a practical sense, sort of how do you, what's your approach to sort of delivering inclusive design that works for wide range of people without sort of what's the word? Without losing out on your aesthetic appeal. That's one of the key things that people are worried about. You mentioned it in your list of worries there. How do you approach that?
Right. So what we tend to think is that good design, whether it's urban or interiors, increases capacity of human functioning overall. And when we design spaces, we our first question before we even start the design brief is how many people's well-being can we impact by whatever we're designing? And that could be negatively or positively. I think that architecture and design has a profound influence on human well-being. And you could see what's happening in the built environment from the perspective of not just the physical health and access, but also from the mental health perspective. So given how much of a human population lives in urban areas, and that's going to be increasing, and then also how much time we actually spend indoors, people really need and deserve more from the places they inhabit. And I think also spaces, they of course need to look good, but they have a way higher purpose than just its aesthetic functions. And I think we have turned into a very visual culture. So for us, aesthetically pleasing spaces and trends are super important. But we must not forget that, this is not a primary function of space. And I think those inquiries have to be met right from the beginning of the concept design. So I also personally challenge that sort of aesthetics, because why should being thoughtful or helpful or trying to be supportive through design be considered a visually offensive thing or unpleasant, right? So I think, again, it's going back to that mindset of what we find in visually pleasing. So when you say, why should the design that it's caring and supportive and thoughtful be considered not pleasing aesthetically or aesthetically offensive? So I think there's a lot of work to do in terms of how we think around the places that we inhabit. So we know very well that if you are designing spaces well, you can increase people's concentration, you can overcome people's bad habits, you can harness creativity, self-expression. It becomes much more, if you have space that it's pleasant, you can reconnect with your family, you can reconnect with friends. We know very well from the statistics how many people cannot even visit their families and friends because their homes are not accessible. So I think this has got a broader impact, and designing home with the accessibility in mind is not just for the occupants, but also potentially for visitors. So I think this is super important for us.
Yeah, here to that. That resonates very strongly with me as a person. I've got several disabled people within my family and friendship network, and the accessibility of where I live has always been top priority for me when I've been house hunting. But it's not until you are in that position potentially that you're thinking about it as a regular householder. Before I move on to our next participant, I just want to shout out to Sam Cornelius Light, who said to Ruth that he really he's got a great accessible home, but not everybody wants to live on their own. So he really appreciates what you're doing in that HMO space, because that's a really valuable option for people to have. So recognize that that's in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to move us along now to a different perspective. Thank you so much, Ruth and Suzanne. And any questions or comments for Ruth and Suzanne, do put them in the Q&A chat. So now going to introduce Mark Fosbrook. So Mark works for the West Midlands Combined Authority. Um, and this combined authority has recently done a big piece of work around its accessible homes landscape and policy, and working with Habinteg and CAE. So we thought it was a great opportunity today to have a talk about that project and what it's done for the authority. So I know that West Midlands wants to become a beacon for inclusion for disabled people. Mark, can you tell us a bit about why was it so important for housing to be part of the mix for that vision?
Yeah, no, it was absolutely essential. I think we've just recently launched this ambition for the region to look at how we become an exemplary region for disabled people that spans across our four mayoral priorities, which are growth for everyone, homes for everyone, jobs for everyone, and journeys for everyone, as well as health, social care, and well-being. And it was absolutely fundamental to understand that so often areas are looked at in isolation across different sectors, and the importance that having an accessible, safe, affordable home has on every other aspect of life just means that we absolutely needed to make sure that it was front and center and part of our consideration and looking at how we shape and build that report. So yeah, just I think very much just wanting to ensure that we had a much better picture and understanding of where we're at as a region. But equally, when Ruth earlier on just spoke around that shocking reality of societal attitudes of people, and the broader report is very much framed around using that, or part of that approach is I use an analogy of the Titanic. So if you imagine the deck chairs on the Titanic are the services that we offer, we move them around to keep people happy. We bring out new deck chairs, new homes, new adaptations, but it's on the Titanic, and that's a system or set of processes that are failing disabled people in a systemic way. And how do we look to rebuild that whole system or repair that hole so it doesn't impact? And then the iceberg is society and the societal attitudes and behaviours, and how can we now look to move that iceberg further away from that system, or melt the iceberg, change the thinking and the attitudes of people altogether. So I think it's important that we look at that in a whole broad perspective and not just go, right, we'll just focus on one particular area.
Mm. So from the work that was done, what were the things, sort of standout points for you, that the highlights of what are the biggest challenges facing disabled people in regard to housing in the West Midlands, or historically, that you're going to be seeking to tackle?
Yeah, I think for me, there were a couple of real key things that stood out. The fact we've got 79% of our homes across the region were built before any accessibility standard existed, meaning that we've got a lot that won't, be able to be necessarily adapted or retrofitted or changed. We've obviously, with the mayor and his clear ambition to increase the amount of homes across the region, there's a real opportunity to shift that narrative and change. From your fantastic work for us, it's predicted that we will require 11,500 wheelchair accessible homes by 2040. And current plans, although we've seen a significant shift in that thinking of the amount of homes that are proposed in those plans, it would still only achieve around about half of that by 2034. So there's still a significant gap. And again, that report has then enabled us to engage with our local authorities and have conversations and really start to change thinking to be a much more data-driven region that says, well, we now know that this is where those gaps are. How do we start to address and plug those gaps? And then I think the other element for me, and the other one that really stood out, was the cost. The cost to build an M42 standard accessible property, is potentially only around about £25,000 more per home, but the return on that investment is over £100,000 over 10 years. And that's, the impact on, benefiting, reducing pressures on social care. It's enabling people to have greater independence, more likely to go out and be economically active, more likely to go out and use our public transport system, more likely to be able to, go and engage with friends and, spend out in our retail and hospitality areas. So actually, if we get it right from a homes perspective, the benefit is not only an economic benefit for the region, but actually provides a significant shift in the well-being of disabled people across the region.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. There was quite a lot of effort within the project to work with disabled people, citizens, like to listen to their views. How important is it from your point of view when we're in this housing mission? Because there's quite a technical. There's a lot of technical stuff around housing, isn't there? The planning element is quite technical, and obviously the building element is quite technical. How important is it to really make that effort to get listening to the people who are going to be hopefully living in these
Yeah,
properties?
I don't think it's an effort. I think it's a fundamental requirement. I think we need to be having conversations with disabled people. The whole of the ambition to look at how we make the West Midlands an exemplary region was very much built and framed around this idea of co-production, was very much built on this idea of how do we amplify the voices of disabled people. As a disabled person myself, I've been fortunate enough to be able to get into a position where I have a bit of a voice, a bit of a platform, but it shouldn't be just my voice. It should be how can I help build and amplify those voices of others? And equally, we know that, as good as, all the technical standards and requirements are, and as good as that thinking and trying to shape something, actually, is it meaningful? Is it worthwhile? So often we'll see, um, an accessible toilet that's been designed or put into a facility, and actually, yes, it aligns with compliance and meets the requirements, but it doesn't actually really work on a meaningful, engaging way. So how can we make sure that we're shifting that thinking? And the same when we're looking at homes is, yeah, we can have a list of different requirements, but everyone is different. Everyone has differing needs. A property that might be really open plan and suitable for a wheelchair user with direct access straight out onto a carport to be able to get in and out of your car, nice and open, may work for that wheelchair user. But if that wheelchair user then has an autistic child who might be prone to suddenly, bolting and running out, having that open access straight onto a road suddenly becomes a safety concern, or having that open plan environment doesn't provide the adequate space for that child to have less sensory overload and decompress. So it needs to be done in a very flexible and more broadly considered approach.
Yeah, I think that was definitely one of the insights that I gained from some of the work that I was involved with the report was by listening actually to both the disabled people we spoke to, but also the people who were working within the local authorities on allocations and trying to find the right place for the right family, and the teams that really had a strong insight into what the people on their waiting lists really needed. So that whether that be, yeah, family homes where, yes, an autistic child may need to have their own bedroom earlier than they normally would in their life story. So actually, those families need more bedrooms, and that should be viewed as an adjustment to policy that should be possible for the local authority to make. Things like soundproofing and all of those things. That was really, really strong message that came out to me. So thank you so much for joining us and for your insights. There may be questions for you in the chat. We can
No
have a
problem.
look at that now. I'm going to let you off the hook, and I'm going to come to Chris Hickins. So Chris is a Habinteg tenant who lives in Milton Keynes and is a member of our Insight Group. So the Insight Group is a group of disabled people and other allies now, supportive professionals who are all interested in the business of accessible homes and promoting better policies in this area. So thank you so much for joining us this morning, Chris, to just tell us a little bit about your housing story. Tell us a little bit about how things were for you before you got your accessible home, if that's okay. Can you tell us a little bit about the backstory and what, why you were looking for an accessible home?
Yeah, good morning. Good morning, Christine, everybody. The main problem that I faced before I got an accessible home was stairs in the lift. In the house. After I had my accident back in 1986, we were living at that time in a two-story house, and the only way I could get up and downstairs was like a baby learning to use stairs for the first time, going up backwards and one step at a time, then coming back down, obviously forwards, not backwards, otherwise I would have been back in hospital. So we then moved to another house that unfortunately was 3 stories. The reason we moved is because the house we were in started to subside. So we woke up one morning to find a little hole in the kitchen where a wall should have been. So we got moved. And again, it was stairs. But this time, instead of having 2 sets of stairs, we had 3. So we had the ground stairs, then one up to the first floor, then another one up to the second floor. And at that time, I had a full length brace fitted. So I was going up with stiff leg this time, but it was the actual going up and down several times a day started getting just a little bit too much for me. And unfortunately, I spoke to Milton Keynes Council just at the right time that Habinteg said, "Oh, we've got a wheelchair accessible house available. Do you know anybody who'd want it?" So after biting their hand off very, very quickly, we moved in here in 1999.
And so what kind of difference did that make to your daily life and your family life?
It changed, I would think, about 100%. I didn't have to worry about what could I do. Could I get to the kitchen? Could I get to the bathroom on time? It was all there. Having it all on one floor meant that, if you like, it's like just having the freedom of moving around and doing what I want to do when I wanted to do it, not when circumstances dictated.
And how did that impact your, what you do with your time, but also how you felt? What was the kind of the impact on your sort of daily life and your well-being, I suppose?
Yeah, and basically, I got myself into the mindset of, right, get on with it. You can't get something's going to change, but not necessarily when I wanted to do. Being ex-forces and things like that, just if you've got a problem in front of you, you get over that problem. Don't just sit there thinking the problem's going to move, because it never will. So mentally, it made me feel that I could do things now with it being in an accessible house that I couldn't do before. So, and one of those things.
Did that have an impact, on your family life and what kinds of activities you got up to? Obviously, now you're very active as a volunteer with Habinteg.
Yeah.
What kind of impact did it have on your sort of on your day to day? So what were the things that were possible that couldn't have been done in the previous property?
In the previous properties, the main thing that couldn't be done was just having the freedom, because being accessible, we could have people around to the house, and also friends in wheelchairs could come in, which made a great difference to it. But it's just the mental and if you like, the mental capacity you have to know that, yeah, you can afford to relax, you can afford to take your time doing things. But say having people coming into the house that aren't met with stairs and things like that is a real bonus.
Fantastic. So you're in the Insight group with Habinteg, and we really value occasions like today and the opportunity to hear directly from disabled people about their lived experiences. What made you motivated to be part of the Insight group?
And I think because I started off being a tenant rep with Habinteg many, many, many years ago, and just by reading the information, the opportunity came up to be to be on the panelist as an Insight member and editorial panel. And I thought, okay, just because I'm not as disabled as a lot of people within Habinteg, but I can still speak as to what how life and that has affected me. So it's a question of actually giving another perspective from not a severely disabled person, but from somebody who can actually add to their voice to help them fight for what they need.
Yeah, fantastic. One of the big things that we're doing today, obviously, is launching a report that's got a 10-year, we're looking back for 10 years and thinking, well, how things have changed in terms of policy for new build accessible homes. If you were looking into the future in 10 years' time, how would you like to see things change? What would be your big change that you'd like to see in the world of accessible housing?
Obviously more of it. But what I would like to see is when people are building a house, then they don't just look to what the current market needs. They need to look further on. With me in 1986, one minute I was fine, I was walking about, and the next minute I was lying on the bottom of a ditch in a 15-foot cavern. Disabilities, illnesses take place immediately. But what I'm thinking is if a house is built that, okay, it's got the correct dimensions it was mentioned about door widths, if they were built as a matter of course, then as people's as they grow older, they change, their families change. If houses need to be adapted, then the basics are there. All they need to do is just add to them, and it will save a lot of time, effort, and upset from disabled people, knowing that if they move into a house when younger, there's a good chance if something happens, they can stay in that house until they're retired, until they no longer need a house. So, yeah, let's start building houses right from the start with the what if capability.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think we can all, everybody on the call, I'm sure, would agree with that. And we were talking yesterday at the report launch about all the opportunities that the government have to kind of to take that view with some foresight, where they're talking about building, you live in a new town, but they're talking about building a whole raft of new towns, and what a great opportunity that is for them to be initiating those new homes as all as future proof in that way, using the M42 standard as a kind of benchmark. I think that would be an amazing step forward. So thank you so much, Chris, for sharing a bit about your story with us today. That's really helpful. And if anyone wants to read more of the stories around different people's perspective, disabled people's perspective on their housing stories, we've got plenty of those on the Habinteg website as well. So do take a dip in there if you are interested. And there's also a few stories in the Living Not Existing report, which in the Forecast for Accessible Homes report too, which we're launching this week. So my final panelist is Farah Munir from Centre for Accessible Environments. So Farah's on the call today to talk to us a little bit about the perspective of what Centre for Accessible Environments is, a department within Habinteg that does consultancy and training work. And some of the consultancy and training that they do as a team is around the housing arena, working with local authorities and architects and others, and a couple of good training courses. So Farah, I just wanted to have a chat with you about sort of how you support your housing related clients at CAE. What kind of people come to you and what do they want?
Sure. Thanks, Christina. And a great report, by the way, really informative. So CAE, obviously, we're part of Habinteg, so that gives us a unique insight as well. We do a lot of work internally as well. So any new developments that Habinteg may be developing, we would be part of the team there, ensuring that they're meeting the guidance and our vision for an accessible or adaptable home. But the large part of the work that we do externally is around design appraisals. So you're typically seeing quite a lot of large multi developments in terms of housing is a large part of that. So local authorities may come to us and say, can you check what this scheme is actually delivering on what they say they're delivering? And sometimes although we don't put planning conditions in, they might come and ask us some particular queries around that. Having a really strong local plan is really helpful for us when we do give that kind of advice. So London is a great example of that as well. And other things we do, obviously the Wheelchair Housing Design Guide and the Inclusive Housing Design Guide, more recently published, where we worked with specialist housing occupational therapists. So that's available on our CAE website as well in terms of buying, or at Reba Bookshop. We're also looking at a PDF copy for that, so watch this space. But if you haven't bought it, it's available, and it's got some really great technical scale drawings in there, which are really good reference point if you're actually on site or working with a team of designers as well. And then another large part of what we do is training. So we provided training for planners, for architects, webinars, full day training. So that's a really helpful way to sort of understand what the standards mean. And we're now trying to incorporate the guidance that we have within the Inclusive Housing Design Guide, going beyond the minimum. And then I don't know, and obviously we've worked with Mark Fosbrook there in terms of providing some insight, data analysis, user consultation, going up to Birmingham and holding a lot of workshops and surveys as well. So that was really informative for us, as well as I hope for WMCA as well on their future policy. And then I don't know if people are aware, CAE runs a Pathways Academy. So here we've now just completed our 4th year, where we're working with disabled people to upskill them and provide them the confidence and technical expertise to start a career in inclusive as an access consultant. I'm really pleased that a lot of them are going down that route, and I definitely know a few of them are really keen on working in the housing sector as well. So having that lived experience would be really helpful for the sector as well. And then I suppose the other thing worth raising is that working internally within Habinteg, and as Mark said earlier, that a lot of the housing stock is already out there. So where we have got stock within Habinteg, we're working with our assets team to incorporate questions around when they do housing stock surveys, so that we know our own stock, and when they're planning some refurbishment or capital works, they've at least got a bit of a knowledge base. And then I think, going out where they've got any particular queries, if they're refurbishing kitchens or bathrooms, they may reach out to us and get some guidance from us. So quite a lot. And obviously, we're really keen to support the work that Habinteg does around campaigning as well, such as today.
Yeah, so what your answer just showed there is like the huge number of different professional stakeholder groups that are involved in actually the accessible housing mission as a whole. When I'm particularly interested, because we've been talking about local plans, to what extent, with local authorities and building control teams, what's the sort of, have you had much call from local authorities and building control stakeholders to sort of help them develop their expertise? Is that something that's been sort of on the roster, been successful?
Planning departments certainly. We're really trying to push for more training in those areas, so reaching out to local authorities. There's been because they can be quite complicated, the planning applications, they do come to us, which we're happy to support, but we're really keen to build capacity as well. So it's certainly something that's on our focus to try and drive that a little bit more. Having guidance like the Inclusive Housing Design Guide is a great resource as well, but it's often a capacity and resource issue within planning teams as well.
Yeah. There's a question in the chat here from a member of the audience who's a chartered engineer saying, what key areas should I focus on to help architects and developers achieve the M42 and M43 standards? Have you got any technical insight that you could draw on for that, to answer that question? So what key areas should I focus on to develop architects
Well, I
and
would say
help
by the
architects and
Inclusive
developers?
Housing Design Guide, because I think it's almost 300 pages of advice going beyond the minimum. But even with architects and designers, we are advising on, they may come to us with plans and layouts that they think are compliant, and we've often gone back and said, well, actually, no. It's particularly an issue if they're refurbishing an existing building, and so you're already working within a sort of constrained site, or the site itself may not be one that we can sort of look at in terms of access to the property as well. So I think the earlier point you raised when you were presenting the report around tightening the wording on plans is so critical, because we can push back a little bit more to say, well, actually, we do need to ensure, for example, you've got 10% of your dwellings are meeting M43. I do know some local authorities, I mean, Southwark's a great example. If for whatever reason they've got a strong mitigation as to why they can't meet it, they actually ask for a penalty, and that funding is then used and it's ring fence for other wheelchair accessible properties somewhere else. So
that's a very interesting idea.
So I really like that. I think they've got stronger, and I know there may be a pushback around financial feasibility cost. We don't get involved in that part of the conversation, but often it's something that happens before they come to us. So yeah, that's
another interesting question here in the chat was regarding where you have like different policies that, you know, different positive policies within a local authority that might conflict. So with active travel rules in one hand, and I think we saw an example of this recently in one of Habinteg's developments. So one policy saying we don't want on-street parking, for example, but the M43 standard saying every wheelchair property needs to have a parking space available within a specific distance. Have you come across with other examples like that, and how they can be solved, or how they have been solved?
So we do sometimes get those issues, but normally our remit is just to look at the layout rather than access to the local neighbourhood. And sometimes these things are optional, so we can't enforce it unless the local authority has given some guidance over and above minimum compliance. And I do think, you know, setting M42 as the minimum is just as Habinteg is advocating, that needs to come into place, because I was just before this webinar, I was looking if any developers have taken that stance to say all of our developments, and I couldn't find anything in terms of any of the large developers. Some housing associations have, obviously Habinteg does as a minimum as well, but and we're also, the other issue I do want to bring up is that there's some new models of housing we're seeing in housing or hotels even in London, which is the pod hotels and co-living spaces. So there's some new emerging ones that we still need to make sure that, particularly with the co-living, that, you know, how do we sort of approach those in terms of making sure that they're accessible and adaptable as well. So there's that's also a challenge.
Yeah, thank you. So final question for you, Farah, before we come to close the session is if there's people on the call today who want to brush up on their knowledge or increase their knowledge around accessible housing design, what's the best place for them to start?
I think
your opportunity to make a further commercial.
Yes, I would say if you're involved in design or development of housing, do look at the REBA design, inclusive design overlay. Do bring on board an access consultant or a specialist housing OT. They bring such insight to your work, to your design, ensuring that accessibility is embedded at an early stage. And then the things I mentioned earlier in terms of buying the guidance, coming on board with our training. We're about to release some webinars that are available, that will be available to architects and anyone interested in some of that work. And yeah, just come and talk to us if you've got anything complicated sites that you particularly want some extra guidance on. We're really happy to do some of that work. And I think some of the work that we did around policies with the WMCA, we're keen to do user engagement. We've got our own access panel as well, which is made up of lived experience and technical expertise. So yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to take, I did promise to try and bring in questions from the chat. It's been more of a challenge than I thought. So I'm going to finish with a couple of questions. So panel members, stand by. I've got one for Suzanne. Have you been able to design any ramps for external doors that look good and are permanent? They're a nice practical question. Suzanne, are you able to answer a question on that? Is Suzanne still here?
Yes, I'm here. So the ramps.
Yes.
Okay, so obviously the ultimate goal is to have a level threshold right from the beginning. So if this is part of the retrofit or larger renovation, it is something that, we continuously look at from the beginning in terms of the access. But I just don't understand why the ramp should be considered aesthetically not pleasing. If it's required, then we've got to consider it and sort of just move beyond it being ugliness in a sense. So yeah, I don't necessarily have got a problem with ramps as long as they're enabling access. So that would be my answer.
Okay.
But yeah, I think avoiding ramps altogether and having level thresholds is probably the best objective to try to achieve always.
Great. Thank you. And then my another question, I think I'd like to direct this one to maybe Ruth and Mark, which is just about the importance of kind of promoting changing the mindset. And we've talked a lot about mindset during this session, haven't we? But what can we do as structurally to make sure that accessible homes are promoted as a good and positive thing and promoted assertively? Is there anything that the industry and policymakers, local government policymakers, can do to help that happen?
From
Ruth?
my perspective, speaking to hundreds of property investors and developers, the small scale and SME style developers, about the need of accessible housing, I think it is just seriously a lack of knowledge and understanding. It's not, everyone I speak to pretty much goes, wow, I had no idea. So I don't think it's necessarily changing the mindset. I think people will want to do this, and I think people we will happily do this. It's just people just don't know. So I would say that primarily is, so people like myself getting out there, educating, speaking to the people who are actually making the decisions. And this is one of the things I come to again, is that we don't have to wait for policy change. As developers and investors and people who are producing the properties, we don't need to be told by government to do it. We can just do it, but we need to educate ourselves. And that's where I've done some training with the CAE. That was really helpful, getting the right guides. But I think it's just, let's keep having these conversations. I put in the chat group, I have a podcast, the Accessible Housing Matters UK podcast. Share that. Let's start getting things like that out to everybody so we can start sharing the conversations. And I think it's also getting as many of the stories like Chris's out there regarding what disabled people are having to deal with. And I think then we'll start to, be a little bit more empathetic as well.
Thank you, Ruth. And Mark, I'll leave the closing thoughts to you. Have you got any thoughts about that? Just how we make those accessible homes part of the general appealing offer of new housing in an area?
Yeah, no, I think it's in terms of getting more visibility of disabled people into positions and roles in employment, in media, in every aspect of life, to show that actually there's a real talent, worth, and opportunity of how we engage better with disabled people. I think even seeing some of the questions, I think there's a chartered designer or someone that's commented who's a wheelchair user, and it's how we amplify and show those individuals and challenge that broader societal perception of disabled people being vulnerable, need supported, cared for, looked after. And actually, yeah, while there are individuals that are more vulnerable than others and do require need and support, actually the breadth of disability is significant, and there are a lot of amazing, talented disabled people out there. And it's how we start to shift that overall narrative, and then, as Ruth said, how we really start to position and highlight those significant inequalities that are faced across everything that we do, and what the reality of life is like for many of those disabled people. And I think often people don't realize the level of inequality, even just with our report, putting all of that data and the reality of life together in one collective brought individuals to tears as they read it, because you see it over in housing, you see it over in transport, you see it in employment and skills, but it's only when you combine it and see the real stark reality of life that many disabled people face. So it's how we start to amplify that further and make sure that co-production is embedded at all levels, and disabled people have a seat around the table.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming around our table this morning, to all of our panelists and to the audience. We've gone over by about 4 minutes, which I think isn't too bad. So I hope you found the session informative, but thank you so much. If you want to follow up on the report, don't forget it's there on our website, and there's a whole raft of suggestions of how you could get involved in Accessible Homes Week and promote this message around accessible housing through your networks to your MPs and your local authorities. So do check that out on the Habinteg website, habinteg.org.uk. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of the day.